The German snipers positioned along the snowy ridges of the Ardennes didn't pull the trigger immediately. They paused, blinking through their telescopic sights, convinced that the freezing fog and lack of sleep had finally induced collective hallucinations. There, amidst the gray death and shattered pine trees of the Belgian front, rode a figure in bright crimson velvet atop a mud-splattered jeep. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying a sack. This isn't a fairy tale about magic reindeer. This is the declassified, gritty reality of December 1944, when the U.S. Army decided that if they couldn't airlift ammunition through the storm, they would deploy a symbol. This is the story of Operation St. Nick. The cold in December 1944 was not merely a weather condition. It was a physical enemy that gnawed at the bones of the 101st Airborne Division. Bastogne, a small market town in Belgium, had become the epicenter of Hitler's desperate last gamble, the offensive known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Inside the perimeter, ammunition was low, medical supplies were exhausted, and hope was freezing over faster than the mud in the foxholes. Private First Class Elias Thorne, a 24-year-old from Ohio with a quiet demeanor and a lanky frame, sat shivering in a dugout that smelled of wet wool and cordite. Before the war, Elias hadn't been a soldier. He had been an actor, struggling to make ends meet in New York, whose biggest claim to fame was playing Santa Claus at the flagship Macy store on 34th Street. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. Elias wasn't holding a toy sack now. He was gripping an M1 Garand with frostbitten fingers. The Germans had the town surrounded. General Anthony McAuliffe had just delivered his famous one-word reply to the German demand for surrender: nuts. It was a morale booster, sure, but bravado didn't keep a soldier warm, and it didn't fill an empty stomach on Christmas Eve. The thick fog had grounded the Allied air support for days. No airdrops, no food, no reinforcements, just the eerie silence of the snow falling between artillery barrages. It was Captain Miller of the Special Services, the branch of the military responsible for entertainment and morale, who found Elias. Miller looked less like an officer and more like a weary schoolteacher who had seen too much. He crawled into Elias's foxhole, ignoring the distant thud of mortar fire. "Thorne," Miller barked, his voice raspy from chain-smoking Lucky Strikes. "I checked your file. It says you have professional theatrical experience, specifically character work during the holidays." Elias looked up, wiping grime from his face. "If you mean I wore a fake beard and let kids scream in my ear for $1 an hour, then yes, sir." "Good," said Miller, reaching into his rucksack. He pulled out something that looked absurdly out of place in the monochromatic gray of the war zone. It was a bundle of red parachute silk, crudely stitched together with white medical gauze trimming. "The general wants to remind the boys what they're fighting for. We can't get mail in, and we can't get turkey in, but psychological operations think seeing St. Nick on the front lines might stop these kids from losing their minds tonight. You're going on a tour, Thorne. Suit up." Elias stared at the makeshift costume. It was ridiculous. It was suicide. A man in red against white snow was nothing but a target practice bullseye for the Wehrmacht. But looking around at the hollow eyes of the men in his platoon, boys who hadn't seen a smile in weeks, he realized this wasn't about him. It was about the only thing left in the box when Pandora let all the evils out. It was about hope. Slowly, Elias began to strip off his heavy combat jacket to pull on the red parachute silk. "Sir," Elias whispered, "if I get shot in this, tell my mother I died a soldier, not a cartoon." Captain Miller didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "You do this right, Thorne, and you'll be more than a soldier. You'll be a legend. We move out in 10 mics. The Jeep is loaded with whatever candy bars and dry socks we could scrounge." The transformation was as grotesque as it was heroic. The red parachute silk was thin, offering absolutely no insulation against the biting Belgian winter. Underneath, Elias kept his wool fatigues and combat boots, creating a lumpy, disjointed silhouette. For a beard, the medics had sacrificed a box of sterile cotton wool, adhering it to Elias's chin with surgical tape that pulled painfully at his skin. He didn't look like the jolly old elf from the Coca-Cola advertisements. He looked like a specter, a fever dream born of exhaustion and desperation. He slung his M1 Garand over his shoulder, the dark wood and cold steel contrasting sharply against the bright crimson fabric. "Your sleigh awaits," Captain Miller said, gesturing toward a battered Willys MB Jeep idling near the tree line. The vehicle had been hastily modified for the occasion. 2 erratic pine branches were lashed to the front bumper, posing as crude antlers, and the windshield was folded down to prevent glinting in the moonlight, exposing the occupants to the raw wind. As the Jeep lurched forward, leaving the relative safety of the command post, the reality of their mission set in. The Ardennes forest was a cathedral of menacing shadows. The tall pines, weighed down with heavy snow, loomed over the narrow logging roads like silent sentinels. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bolt-action rifle being chambered. Elias sat exposed in the passenger seat, clutching a burlap sack, not filled with toys, but with the most precious commodities on the front line: dry socks, D-ration chocolate bars, unfiltered cigarettes, and letters that had been stuck at the battalion headquarters for weeks. They reached the first perimeter outpost 20 minutes later. It was manned by a squad of the 327th Glider Infantry. The men were huddled in foxholes, half buried in snow, trying to heat cans of frozen beans over smokeless fuel tablets. When the Jeep rolled out of the fog, the sentry raised his Thompson submachine gun, shouting, "Halt! Password!" "Betty Grable," Tex shouted back, giving the countersign. "And hold your fire, son. We got a VIP." Elias stood up in the Jeep. His legs were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer absurdity of the moment. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine needles and diesel fumes, and channeled every ounce of his theater training. He forced his voice into a deep, resonant baritone that defied his lanky frame. "Merry Christmas, boys!" he bellowed, the sound carrying eerily through the frozen air. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The soldiers didn't cheer, they stared, slack-jawed. For a moment, the war didn't exist. There was no Wehrmacht, no artillery, no frostbite. There was just a man in red in the middle of hell. Then a young private, no older than 18, slowly climbed out of his hole. His face was caked in mud, his eyes hollow. He walked toward the Jeep as if approaching a religious shrine. "Santa?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Elias hopped down, the red silk fluttering. He reached into the sack and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks and a pack of Chesterfields. "Courtesy of Uncle Sam," Elias said softly, pressing the items into the boy's trembling hands. The boy looked at the socks, then up at Elias, and tears began to cut tracks through the dirt on his face. It wasn't about the supplies. It was the sudden, jarring reminder that a world existed outside of this frozen nightmare, a world where people sat by fires and opened gifts. "Move it, Santa," Tex hissed, eyeing the dark tree line. "Jerry creates a perimeter too. We can't stay in one spot." Elias scrambled back into the Jeep, waving as they sped off. As they rounded the bend, Elias looked back. The entire squad was standing up, watching the red figure disappear into the mist, their weapons lowered, a fleeting spark of life returning to their eyes. But the deeper they went into the forest, the closer they got to the German lines, and the red suit began to feel less like a costume and more like a target. The deeper they pushed into the Ardennes, the more the geography dissolved into a featureless void of white and gray. The map on Tex's lap was useless. The signposts had been twisted around by saboteurs or flattened by tank treads days ago. They were drifting through the ghost front, a porous sector where the front line wasn't a line, but a deadly shifting mosaic of isolated pockets.
The engine's hum seemed deafening in the silence, a mechanical heartbeat that Elias feared would draw every panzer within 10 miles. Elias clutched the sack of supplies to his chest, his knuckles white against the red fabric. The initial rush of bringing joy to the glider troops had faded, replaced by a cold, metallic dread. He realized with terrifying clarity that he was the only thing in this entire forest that wasn't camouflaged. He was a neon flare in a world of shadows. "Tex," Elias whispered, his teeth chattering. "I think we're too far out. I haven't seen a GI helmet in 2 miles. "Quiet," Tex hissed, killing the headlights instantly. The Jeep rolled to a stop, the tires crunching softly over crushed ice. "I saw movement. 2 o'clock, near the ridge."
Elias squinted through the freezing mist. At first, he saw nothing but the skeletal remains of birch trees. Then, the shadows detached themselves from the wood line. They weren't American. The silhouette was unmistakable. The flared skirt of the Stahlhelm helmet, the long gray greatcoats. It was a German Wehrmacht patrol, perhaps a dozen men, moving silently across the road less than 50 yards ahead. They were close enough that Elias could hear the clinking of their equipment and the low murmur of German commands. Tex reached for his grease gun but froze. If he fired, they were dead. 2 men against a squad was a suicide pact. The only option was to sit perfectly still and pray the fog rendered them invisible. But Elias wasn't invisible. He was a splash of crimson blood on a white canvas. One of the German soldiers turned. He stopped mid-stride, his MP-40 submachine gun raised halfway. He squinted, blinking rapidly, as if his eyes were betraying him. He tapped the shoulder of the man next to him, pointing toward the Jeep. Slowly, the entire patrol stopped. 12 barrels turned toward the American vehicle. Elias stopped breathing. This was it, the end of the show. But the shots didn't come. The German soldiers stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what they were seeing. In the middle of the bloodiest offensive of the war, under the cover of a freezing night, sat Santa Claus. The psychological dissonance was absolute. Was it a trick? A hallucination brought on by schnapps and sleep deprivation? An American psychological weapon? The absurdity short-circuited their military training. For 10 agonizing seconds, the war paused. The German squad leader lowered his binoculars, his mouth slightly agape, staring at the bearded figure in the Jeep. Elias, acting on a frantic instinct that he couldn't explain, didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he slowly raised a gloved hand and gave a stiff, solemn wave. The officer hesitated. Then, in a moment that defied all logic of warfare, he didn't order his men to fire. He simply shook his head, tapped his temple with his index finger, as if to say, "The Americans have finally gone insane," and signaled his men to move on. They drifted back into the fog, glancing over their shoulders like men leaving a haunted graveyard. "Jesus H. Christ," Tex exhaled, the air rushing out of him in a cloud of steam. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely grip the wheeling wheel. "Did that just happen? Did they just let us go because you're him?" "Drive," Elias croaked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Just drive, Tex." Tex slammed the Jeep into gear, and they peeled away, mud slinging. But the truce of the absurd couldn't last forever. As the Jeep roared back onto the main logging road, the sound of an engine, much larger, much louder, and distinctly diesel, roared to life behind them. A spotlight cut through the fog, blinding them in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the foot patrol this time. It was a half-track, and the heavy thud-thud-thud of a mounted MG-42 machine gun began to chew up the snow around them. The spell was broken. Santa was back in the war. The air around the Jeep disintegrated into a chaotic storm of splintered wood and shredded snow. The MG-42 machine gun, known to the GIs as Hitler's boss saw because of its terrifying rate of fire, chewed through the tree trunks lining the road as if they were made of paper. Bullets sparked off the Jeep's rear fender, sending hot shrapnel pinging against the metal frame. Tex screamed something unintelligible, wrestling the wheeling wheel as the Willys MB fishtailed violently on the black ice. The spotlight from the pursuing German half-track washed over them, illuminating Elias in a grotesque, blinding halo of crimson.
"Get down!" Tex roared, slamming the Jeep into a sharp left turn, abandoning the logging road for the dense, uncleared forest. The vehicle went airborne for a terrifying second, crashing down into a frozen creek bed with a bone-jarring crunch that nearly bit through Elias's tongue. The suspension groaned in protest, but the four-wheel drive clawed at the muddy bank, dragging them up the other side and deeper into the shadows. Behind them, the German half-track slowed. Its heavy treads weren't designed for the tight, winding gaps between the ancient pines. The spotlight swept the trees frantically, searching for the splash of red, but the dense fog of the Ardennes had swallowed them whole. The engine noise of the pursuer faded from a roar to a frustrated rumble, but Tex didn't let up. He drove for another mile in pitch darkness, navigating by the faint reflection of the snow, until the Jeep finally sputtered and died in a small clearing. "Radiators busted," Tex whispered, the silence of the forest rushing back in, ringing in their ears. "Walk in where, Tex?" Elias asked, his breath pluming in the dark. "We're completely turned around." Before Tex could answer, the distinct clack-clack of a bolt-action rifle echoed from the darkness directly in front of them. "Drop it," a voice hissed from the gloom. It was American, accented with the distinct drawl of the Deep South. "Hands where I can see 'em, and tell me the password before I blow your heads off." "Wallace Beery," Tex shouted the countersign, his hands shooting up. "Don't shoot, we're 101." A figure emerged from the snow-covered brush, followed by three others. They were ghosts, soldiers clad in white bedsheets scavenged from Belgian farmhouses to act as winter camouflage. They looked gaunt, their eyes sunken, clearly men who had been cut off from the main force for days. The lead soldier, a sergeant with a dirty bandage wrapped around his head, lowered his rifle slowly. He squinted at the two men standing by the broken Jeep. His eyes moved from Tex to Elias. He blinked once, twice. "Sarge," one of the men behind him whispered, sounding delirious. "Am I dead? Is this heaven?" The sergeant walked up to Elias, poking the red velvet of the suit with the barrel of his rifle, as if testing to see if it was real. "You gotta be kidding me. We haven't eaten in 3 days. We're down to 2 clips of ammo per man. We're waiting for panzers to roll over us, and HQ sends us Santa Claus." Elias straightened up. The fear from the chase was gone, replaced by the weight of the mission. He looked at these men, ragged, freezing, and on the brink of collapse. He didn't say a word. He simply turned back to the Jeep, grabbed the burlap sack, and tossed it to the sergeant. "It's not ammo, Sarge," Elias said, his voice steady, "but it's Hershey's, dry socks, and letters from home, and I got a bottle of bourbon tucked in my boot." The sergeant caught the sack. He looked at it, then back at Elias, and for the first time in what must have been an eternity, the hard lines of his face cracked. A jagged, yeary grin spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he chuckled, the sound dry and rasping. "Looks like we made the nice list after all, boys. Get 'em inside the perimeter." The sanctuary was a root cellar beneath the skeletal remains of a dairy farm, accessible only by a trap door hidden under a pile of scorched hay. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and the metallic tang of dried blood. A single kerosene lantern flickered in the center, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. There were 8 men in the squad, the remnants of a platoon that had been chewed up by the initial German assault days prior. They looked less like soldiers and more like shipwreck survivors, their eyes glassy and hollow. Elias sat on an overturned crate in the center of the room, the red velvet now stained with grease and mud, looking like a fallen king holding court. He didn't break character. He couldn't. These men didn't need Elias Thorne, the terrified actor. They needed the myth. He reached into the burlap sack, his movements deliberate and theatrical.
"Private," Elias boomed gently, pointing to a soldier nursing a trench foot that had turned a worrisome shade of purple. "I believe you asked for something to keep the chill off." He tossed a pair of thick, dry wool socks to the man. The soldier caught them, burying his face in the rough fabric, inhaling the scent of clean wool as if it were expensive perfume. To another, he handed a tin of Spam and a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. To the sergeant, he passed the bottle of bourbon. The bottle made the rounds in reverent silence, each man taking a small, burning sip, closing their eyes as the warmth hit their empty stomachs. For 20 minutes, the war outside ceased to exist. There were no 88mm shells, no screaming memes, no frostbite. There was just the flicker of the lamp and the crinkle of paper as Elias handed out the most valuable treasure of all, the mail. A young corporal named Smitty sat in the corner, his hands trembling as he tore open an envelope that had been postmarked in Topeka, Kansas 3 months ago. The room went silent, watching him. Smitty read the first few lines, his lips moving silently, before he let out a choked sob that sounded like a laugh. "She had the baby," Smitty whispered, looking up, tears cutting through the grime on his cheeks. "It's a girl. Her name is Rose. She says she looks like me." Elias smiled, a genuine, heartbreaking smile beneath the fake beard. "A Christmas miracle, Corporal." The mood in the cellar shifted. The tension that had held their shoulders tight for days began to unravel. Men started to talk, to joke, to remember who they were before they were targets. It was a fragile, beautiful bubble of peace. And then the world ended. A high-pitched whistle, like a tearing sheet, pierced through the stone ceiling, followed instantly by a deafening crump. Dust and mortar rained down from the beams above. The lantern flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Incoming!" the sergeant roared, his voice snapping back into command mode instantly. "They're walking the mortars in! Helmets on! Get your gear!" Another explosion rocked the foundation, closer this time. The sanctuary was becoming a tomb. "They tracked the jeep!" Tex shouted over the ringing in their ears. "We led them right to the door!" "Out! Everybody out!" the sergeant screamed, kicking the trapdoor open. "Move to the secondary line! Go! Go!" Elias scrambled up the ladder, the red suit snagging on a splintered beam. He burst out into the freezing night air, just as a mortar shell slammed into the barn 10 yards away. The shock wave threw him face first into the snow. His ears were ringing, his vision blurring. He pushed himself up, spitting blood, and saw the tree line erupting with muzzle flashes. The Germans weren't just shelling them, they were attacking. Infantry was advancing through the snow, dark shapes moving against the white backdrop. And Elias, in his bright red suit, was standing right in the open. The snow around Elias erupted into geysers of white powder and black dirt as the German machine gunners zeroed in on the conspicuous splash of red. Being Santa Claus was no longer a morale booster, it was a death sentence. The bright crimson silk, intended to bring cheer, was now a neon sign screaming, "Shoot here," to every Wehrmacht soldier in the sector. "Get up! Move, damn it!" Tex screamed, grabbing Elias by the back of his harness and hauling him to his feet. The air was alive with the angry hornet's buzz of passing bullets. Elias stumbled, his boots slipping on the ice, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He wasn't thinking about the play, or the character, or the irony. He was running on pure reptilian panic. The squad from the cellar was moving in a ragged line toward a ridge of heavy timber about 50 yards away. They were firing back as they ran, the sharp crack-crack-crack of their M1 Garans answering the deeper, throatier chug of the German MG-42s. Elias fumbled with his rifle, bringing it to his shoulder, but he couldn't see a target. The enemy was just a series of muzzle flashes in the dark tree line. He fired blindly into the shadows, the recoil of the rifle bruising his shoulder, the empty brass casing ejecting into the snow with a metallic ping. Suddenly, Corporal Smitty, the boy who had just received the news about his daughter, let out a sharp grunt and crumpled mid-stride. He hit the ground hard, clutching his thigh. "Man down!" the sergeant roared, laying down suppressing fire with his Thompson. Elias didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He saw the boy lying in the open, blood rapidly staining the white snow dark, and he turned back. The red suit billowed as he sprinted toward Smitty. Bullets zipped past his head, snapping branches and thudding into the earth, but miraculously none found the man in the velvet suit. It was as if the sheer absurdity of his appearance was throwing off the German aim. Elias skid to a halt beside Smitty, grabbing the corporal by his combat webbing. "I got you, kid! I got you!" Elias shouted over the din of battle. He heaved, dragging the wounded soldier through the slush. Smitty was groaning, his face pale, clutching the letter from his wife in one blood-slicked hand. "Don't let me die here, Santa," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Not tonight, Corporal. Not on my watch," Elias grunted, pulling with every ounce of strength he had. Tex appeared on Smitty's other side, and together they dragged him over the lip of the ridge and down into the safety of a shallow ravine. They collapsed into the mud, gasping for air, as the rest of the squad tumbled in around them. The sergeant slid down last, his face grim. "They're flanking us," he spat, checking his ammo. "We can't stay here. If they set up a mortar on that rise, we're finished." Elias looked down at his suit. It was shredded, covered in mud and Smitty's blood. The beard was hanging by a single strip of tape. He looked at the pinned-down men, exhausted, outnumbered and terrified. He realized then that the Germans were concentrating all their fire on the last place they saw the red suit. A crazy, theatrical idea began to form in Elias's mind. It was the kind of idea that belonged on a stage, not a battlefield. "Sarge," Elias said, his voice strangely calm, "they want the Red Devil, don't they? They're fixated on the suit." "Yeah, you're a walking bullseye, Thorne. What's your point?" Elias stood up, tightening the belt of his ruined costume. "My point is, if I go left, making a lot of noise and looking like a panicked idiot, they'll follow the red. That gives you and the boys a window to break right and get Smitty to the medic station." Tex stared at him. "You can't be serious. That's suicide. You're an actor, not a hero." Elias looked at Tex, then at the letter in Smitty's hand. He gripped his rifle tight. "Tonight, Tex, I'm playing the lead." The sergeant looked at Elias for a long, heavy second. There was no time for sentimental speeches or arguments about chain of command. The logic of war was brutal and mathematical. Sacrifice the pawn to save the king. In this case, the pawn was dressed in red velvet. "You got guts, Thorne," the sergeant growled, gripping Elias's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Give us 30 seconds. Once they turn their guns on you, we move. Don't die out there." "Break a leg," Tex whispered, his voice tight. Elias took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cordite and pine resin. He checked the clip in his Garand one last time, though he knew he wasn't going to shoot his way out of this. He needed to be loud, fast, and impossible to ignore. He scrambled up the muddy embankment of the ravine, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He paused at the crest, silhouetted against the pale moonlight reflecting on the snow.
"Hey!" Elias screamed, his voice projecting with the diaphragm power of a man who had performed Shakespeare in the park without a microphone. "Over here! Come and get your presents, you sons of bitches!" He fired 2 rounds into the air and took off running, not toward the safety of the American lines, but laterally across the ridge, fully exposed. The effect was instantaneous. The German line, confused by the sudden appearance of the red phantom, shifted their fire with terrifying discipline. The MG-42 machine gun swiveled, its muzzle flash lighting up the tree line like a strobe light. A line of tracers tore through the air, chasing Elias as he sprinted through the deep snow. The ground around him erupted in small geysers of ice and dirt. He could hear the angry snap hiss of bullets passing inches from his ears. Elias ran with a desperation he didn't know he possessed. He hurdled fallen logs and crashed through frozen brambles that tore at the silk suit and the skin beneath. He was a splash of crimson chaos in a monochrome world. Every time he felt the German fire slacking, he would stop, fire a round back blindly, and wave his arms, drawing the hate back onto himself. He was the matador, and the Wehrmacht was the bull. Behind him, in the ravine, he could hear the faint sounds of the squad moving out, the snapping of twigs, the grunts of effort as they carried Smitty away from the kill zone. It was working. The Germans were so fixated on the Red Devil that they had completely lost track of the actual combat unit. But the gambit had a cost. Elias was tiring. The heavy combat boots were like lead weights in the slush, and the adrenaline was beginning to curdle into cold fear. The German infantry was advancing, their shouts getting closer. "Da ist er! Schieß! There he is! Shoot!" He dove behind the trunk of a massive oak tree just as a burst of machine gun fire shredded the bark on the other side, showering him with wood splinters. He was pinned. He couldn't go back, and he couldn't stay here. He looked down at the red suit. It was ruined, tattered, and soaked in sweat. It had served its purpose. Now it was just a target. With trembling hands, Elias began to rip the costume off. He tore at the buttons, shedding the red silk jacket and the padded trousers, revealing his olive drab uniform underneath. He peeled the tape from his chin, wincing as it took some of his skin with it, and stuffed the fake beard into his pocket. He balled up the red suit and shoved it deep into the hollow of the tree roots, burying it under a layer of snow and dead leaves. Santa Claus was gone. Private Thorne was back. But he was alone, miles behind enemy lines, with a German hunting party closing in from 3 sides. The woods were alive with the guttural shouts of the search party. Beams of flashlights cut through the darkness like sabers, slicing through the fog and dancing over the snow-covered roots. Elias lay flat on his stomach in a shallow depression about 30 yards away, buried under a pile of rotting leaves and fresh snow. He stopped breathing, his heart hammering against the frozen ground so hard he was sure the vibrations would give him away. He watched through a gap in the brush as 3 German soldiers approached the oak tree where he had made his change. One of them, a tall, non-commissioned officer, kicked the base of the tree. His boot struck something soft. He bent down, brushing away the snow, and pulled out the crumpled ball of red crimson. The soldiers froze. The NCO held the tattered Santa suit up by one sleeve. In the harsh glare of the flashlights, it looked like the flayed skin of a mythical beast. The Germans began to argue rapidly in hushed tones. They were confused. They had been chasing a man in red, firing at a man in red, and now they held the red skin, but the man had vanished into the ether. Was it a partisan trick? A psychological operation? Or had the Americans simply lost their minds? The NCO threw the suit to the ground in disgust, spat on it, and barked an order. They fanned out, their rifles raised, but their confidence was shaken. They weren't looking for a soldier anymore. They were looking for a ghost. Elias used their confusion to move. He didn't stand up, he slithered. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged himself backwards through the mud and ice, moving only when the wind gusted to mask the sound of his movement. His hands were numb, his knees scraped raw, but he kept going until the voices of the Germans faded into the distance. He was alone, truly alone. The silence of the Ardennes returned, heavy and oppressive. Without the adrenaline of the chase and the insulating layer of the padded suit, the cold attacked him with renewed viciousness. His olive drab uniform was damp with sweat that was now freezing against his skin. He needed shelter, and he needed to find the American lines before he froze to death or stumbled into another patrol. He walked for what felt like hours, navigating by the stars that occasionally peeked through the break in the clouds. The terrain grew rougher, the trees denser. Sometime past midnight, he smelled smoke, not the acrid scent of cordite, but the distinct earthy smell of a wood fire. He crept forward, cresting a small rise, and looked down into a valley. What he saw stopped him cold. Below him, moving along a narrow logging road that shouldn't have been able to support them, was a column of armor. These weren't the light half-tracks from earlier. These were monsters. Massive Tiger II tanks, painted in winter whitewash, their long 88mm barrels pointing forward like accusing fingers. They were moving under the cover of darkness and fog, engines rumbling with a low, tectonic growl.
Scores of infantry walked beside them. Elias realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't just behind enemy lines, he was witnessing the main vein of the German counterattack. This was the spearhead intended to break the siege of Bastogne, and the Americans, his unit, the guys in the cellar, headquarters, had no idea this much heavy armor was moving through this specific sector. The mission had changed. He wasn't just a lost actor trying to save his own skin anymore. He was carrying intelligence that could save hundreds of lives. He had to get back. He turned to skirt along the ridge, moving parallel to the tanks, when he saw a small stone structure nestled against the side of a cliff, half hidden by overgrown pines. It looked like an old woodsman's hut or charcoal burner's shelter. A faint sliver of light escaped from beneath the door. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but his extremities were losing feeling. He needed 5 minutes of warmth to keep his blood moving. Elias approached the door, his rifle raised. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open and swung his weapon into the room. "Don't move," he rasped. Inside, there were no German soldiers. There was a small fire in the hearth, and huddled in the corner, clutching a pitchfork, was an old woman with a face like a dried apple, and a small girl, no older than 7, staring at him with terrified, saucer-wide eyes. Elias lowered the barrel of his M1 Garand slowly, realizing how terrifying he must look, a blood-spattered, mud-caked giant bursting out of the night. "American," he whispered, tapping the white star insignia on his shoulder patch. "Ami? I'm a friend." The old woman didn't let go of the pitchfork, but her grip loosened slightly. She scrutinized his face, her eyes darting to the strange, sticky white patches on his chin where the surgical tape had ripped away the skin. She muttered something in a dialect of Walloon French that Elias couldn't catch, but the tone wasn't aggressive, it was resigned. She lowered the makeshift weapon and gestured to the fire. It was a silent invitation born of the universal law of winter. Deny no one warmth, not even a stranger with a gun. Elias slumped against the stone wall near the hearth, the heat washing over him like a physical blow. His hands began to sting as the blood rushed back into his frozen fingers. The little girl hadn't blinked. She was staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She pointed a small, grime-stained finger at his face. "Père Noël," she whispered. Elias froze. He touched his chin. The remnants of the cotton wool and the white adhesive were still there. Even without the red suit, something about him, perhaps just the linger of the role, or perhaps just the desperate hope of a child, had sparked recognition. He managed a weak,
Exhausted smile. He reached into his combat jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against lint and spent shell casings, until he found it. A single, slightly melted square of de-rationed chocolate he had missed during the distribution at the cellar. He held it out. The girl hesitated, then darted forward like a bird, snatched the chocolate, and retreated to her grandmother's skirts. The old woman looked at Elias, her eyes softening. "Merci," she murmured. "Bastogne?" Elias asked, making a circular motion with his hand. "Which way?" The woman pointed a gnarled finger toward the north, then shook her head violently. "Non, trop de Boche. Tanks." She made a crushing motion with her hands to simulate the heavy armor he had seen earlier. She knew. The locals always knew. Elias nodded grimly. He had to get out. He had to warn the perimeter that a hammer blow was coming from a direction they weren't expecting. But before he could push himself off the wall, the sound of the world outside changed. The low rumble of the passing convoy was cut through by the sharp screech of brakes directly outside the hut. A heavy vehicle had stopped. The old woman gasped, pulling the girl into her lap and throwing a heavy wool blanket over their heads. Elias scrambled to his feet, panic flaring. There was no back exit. The hut was a stone box. He looked around frantically and saw a narrow loft above the main room filled with dry hay. "Schnell, machen Sie die Tür auf. Quick, open the door,"
A voice barked from outside, followed by a heavy fist pounding on the wood. Elias didn't have time to think. He launched himself upwards, grabbing the rough-hewn beams and hauling his body into the darkness of the loft just as the latch on the door below clicked open. He buried himself in the hay, pressing his face into the dust, clutching his rifle to his chest. The door swung open, letting in a swirl of snow and the silhouette of 2 German officers. They stepped into the warmth, their long leather trench coats glistening with ice. One of them scanned the room, his eyes passing over the trembling old woman and the child. He didn't seem interested in them. He walked to the fire, warming his gloved hands, and looked around the room with the practiced suspicion of a predator. "It smells like American tobacco," the officer said in German, sniffing the air. He turned slowly, his gaze drifting up toward the dark loft where Elias lay, his heart beating so loud he was certain it echoed off the rafters. The officer unholstered his Luger, the movement casual, yet terrifyingly precise. He took a step toward the wooden ladder that led to the loft. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the fire, swirling upward into the darkness where Elias lay. Elias tightened his grip on the M1 Garand, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. He knew he could take the officer, maybe even the second one by the door, but the sound would alert the entire convoy outside. It would be a short, violent last stand. The old woman suddenly stood up. She moved with a surprising swiftness, placing herself between the officer and the ladder. She began to speak loudly, gesturing wildly with her hands. She pointed to the fire, then to her own pipe resting on the mantelpiece, miming the act of smoking. She grabbed a pouch of rough local tobacco and thrust it toward the German, chattering about her husband, the weather, the poor quality of the leaf, anything to fill the air with noise. The officer looked at her, annoyed. He holstered his weapon, clearly deciding that interrogating a senile Belgian grandmother wasn't worth the effort. He shoved her aside, not gently, but not violently enough to knock her down. He grabbed a loaf of black bread from the table, tucked it under his arm, and turned to his companion. "Let's go. We have a schedule. The attack begins at 0400. 0400. The time burned into Elias's brain. That was 3 hours from now. The Germans left, slamming the door behind them. The sound of their engine revving and fading away was the sweetest music Elias had ever heard. He waited a full 2 minutes before sliding down from the loft. The old woman was slumped in her chair, clutching the girl. She looked up at him, her face pale. 0400, Elias repeated. 4 o'clock. They attack. She nodded, understanding the gravity. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the back of the hut. She pushed aside a heavy wooden cupboard, revealing a small, jagged hole in the stone wall that led into what looked like an old mine tunnel or root cellar extension. "Tunnel, sortie, north," she whispered. It was a smuggler's route, or perhaps an old escape path from the Great War. It didn't matter. It was a way past the tank column. Elias grabbed her hand and squeezed it. "Thank you," he said. He looked at the little girl who was still munching on the chocolate. "Merry Christmas." Elias plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. It was cramped, smelling of wet earth and decay, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. He moved as fast as he could, scraping his elbows, ignoring the claustrophobic weight of the earth above him. He crawled for what felt like a mile, until the air grew fresher and colder. He emerged into a thicket of bushes on the side of a hill, overlooking a valley floor bathed in moonlight. Below him, about a mile away, lay the American perimeter. He could see the faint outlines of foxholes and the dark shapes of Sherman tanks dug in for the night. But between him and them lay a stretch of open ground, the killing fields, and he had less than 3 hours to cross it, get through the American sentries without getting shot by his own side, and deliver the warning about the 4 a.m. assault. He stood up and began to run. He wasn't running for his life anymore. He was running for Bastogne. He was running for Smitty, for the kid who got the socks, for the old woman in the hut. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. Private Thorne had entered the war a reluctant actor, but he was sprinting toward the finish line as a soldier. But as he broke from the tree line into the open field, a flare popped overhead. It drifted down slowly on a parachute, bathing the entire valley in a stark, blinding white light. Thorne froze. He was caught in the open, again. The flare hissed overhead, suspending Thorne in a terrifying, artificial daylight. He felt naked, stripped of the darkness that had been his only shield. Almost immediately, the ground to his left erupted as a German machine gunner behind him adjusted his aim. The bullets snapped through the air like cracking whips, driving him face first into the frozen mud. But the real danger lay ahead. From the American lines, he heard the distinctive racking of bolts. Hundreds of tired, trigger-happy paratroopers were staring down their sights at the lone figure sprinting across the kill zone. To them, he was just a silhouette, a potential saboteur, or the lead scout of a German assault wave. "Hold fire!" Elias screamed, his voice shredding his throat. "Blue! Blue!" He used the universal color code for friendly forces, but the wind snapped his words away. A round from an American M1 struck the ground inches from his nose, spraying ice into his eyes. They were bracketing him. He was going to be killed by the very men he was trying to save. But panic clawed at his chest, but his actor's brain, forged in the high-pressure crucible of live theater, suddenly took over. He realized that standard military protocol wouldn't work. It was too chaotic. He needed to be distinct. He needed to be impossible. Thorne scrambled to his knees, ignoring the tracers zipping past him, and cupped his hands around his mouth. He didn't shout a password. He didn't beg. Instead, he channeled the deep, resonant baritone he had used in the Jeep, the voice that had momentarily stopped a war. "On Dancer! On Prancer! On Donner and Blitzen!" The absurdity of the shout cut through the tension like a knife. It was so out of place, so maniacally bizarre, that the American firing line hesitated. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the American .30 caliber machine gun ceased abruptly.